Welcome to Chalk Talk, the Pro Football Focus DFS podcast. I am your host, Scott Barrett, and manning the co-pilot seat is DFS virtuoso Tyler Buecher. Tyler, how's it going?
It's going great, Scott. I'm trying to figure out how many different adjectives you can use to describe me as we do these intros.
I'm running low, but I think we'll be good until maybe week 6, and then I'll have to start using other languages.
And then the grind continues. I like it.
Tyler, how was your week 2?
Week 2 is up and down for me. Cash games were pretty tough. The Sam Bradford injury made me do a lot of pivoting, created a whole new cash lineup, and the second lineup tanked. If I would have kept the original one, I would have scored 25, 30 more points. It was very tilting. Luckily, I was able to bounce back in tournaments. Ended up putting me about a net 0. How'd you end up doing?
Well, I learned a valuable lesson this week, which is always important, honing, perfecting the process. And I realized I was a little too aggressive in ownership. I went heavy on guys like Ezekiel Elliott and Julio Jones, who we talked up. I was at 100%, which is far too high. It was a lesson learned, but not one I paid too dearly on. I was held afloat by some of my 5 to 15% guys. I had a lot of J.J. Nelson, Brandon Coleman, Todd Gurley. I was a little too embarrassed to talk him up on this podcast, but I mentioned him on our Roto Grinders podcast. He had a big day. Had a bunch of Gronk. Also had like 90% Zach Miller, who I think I'm going to go back to the well on this week. But yeah, I learned, I should probably cap my ownership on any one player at 60 or 70% in tournaments. I did really well in cash this week. Unfortunately, I just didn't play too much of it. Felt pretty good about tournaments. And of course, the thorn on my side, the bane of my week 2 was the player prop bet I made with you, which I still contend was a good bet by me. Week 1, Gerald Everett saw 28 snaps and 1 target. George Kittle saw 54 snaps and 6 targets. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure, George Kittle's going to outscore Gerald Everett. And nope, Tyler, the virtuoso, wins again.
You can't doubt Sean McVay and his usage of the tight end. I'm telling you, man. He's been doing it since Jordan Reed, and he'll do it again here with LA.
You're right. I'm expecting big things from Everett, more so in terms of dynasty. Not as bold, but I do think big things are coming in. And I loved him coming out of college too. He led all tight ends in missed tackles forced per reception. Really explosive athlete. Tested well at the combine. And because I lost this bet, I'm pretty sure, we'll see if recording's an issue, but I may have to do a wrap at the end of this podcast, so stay tuned for that. I'm sure it's going to be embarrassing. But props to Tyler. Always seems to get the better of me. With this in mind, I need to know who your top quarterback of the week is, because that is a position I am lost on. There's just so many unknowns and a lot of guys in the same range in terms of value for me. Who should we be looking at?
Unlike week 2, I think that we've got a lot of different options here at the quarterback position at varying price ranges. The guy that I'm looking for, if I'm paying up for a quarterback, is probably going to be Matt Ryan. This is looking like my favorite game of the week to game stack in tournaments, but I think Ryan and Matthew Stafford could both be in for cash game consideration. The 50.5 game total continues to move up since their opening line of 48.5 points, and the Falcons are currently 3-point road favorites. The Lions allowed the second most passing touchdowns and third most fantasy points last year, allowing several 30-burgers to opponent QBs. Ryan could beat the Lions passing to just about any one of his targets, as Detroit doesn't have any defensive pieces to keep up with their wide receivers, running backs, tight ends. Syrup over pancakes, as my man Rumford Johnny likes to say, and Ryan is the syrup that can sweeten your GPP lineups with a massive score.
Whoa. What a line, Tyler. All right.
Proud of that one.
So we know quarterbacks have a positive correlation to each other. And we know this is the second highest game total of the week per Vegas. What do you think? It's a close game, implying shootout potential, only 3 points. Atlanta is favored by on the road. What do you think about bringing it back with Matthew Stafford, who's been very efficient so far this season, despite a tough matchup last week against the Giants?
I think it's a great play, and he's a lot cheaper than Ryan, almost $900 in salary savings. The Falcons allowed the third most passing touchdowns last year to opposing quarterbacks, the second most fantasy points. I think Stafford's in a great play here, and I think almost all of his weapons are as well.
Another guy I feel we have to bring up, just because this seems like such a smash shot for him. Definitely concerns as well, but Cam Newton's facing a New Orleans Saints defense that has been one of the worst in the league for the better part of the last decade. So far, they're allowing the second most points per game. Last year, second most points per game. 2015, most points per game. 2014, fifth most points per game. They allowed 341 and 436 passing yards in the last 2 weeks. I feel like you start Cam Newton this week, or you don't start him again for the rest of the year. PFF's grades have been harsh on him. He's our 10th worst graded quarterback this season. Maybe a little rusty with that shoulder, coming back off of that shoulder surgery. Didn't get much playing time in preseason. Does he smash this week?
That's the question. I think the way that I'm going to play it is I will completely fade Newton outside of single entry GPPs and just play him there. That's going to be my hedge, basically. The problem with Newton is since entering the league in 2011, no quarterback has had more hits. Like, those hits have clearly taken a toll on Newton's body. His shoulder injury, you could tell, is slowing him down. He's just been wildly inaccurate dating back to last year. He's one of our least accurate quarterbacks in almost any statistic: under pressure, deep passes, clean pocket. It doesn't matter. Newton's been struggling, and I'm honestly very uncomfortable playing Newton, especially now that he lost his best weapon in Greg Olsen.
Yeah, he's really not played well, and he hasn't for a while. Since week 2 of last season, he only has one game with a passer rating above 95. Last year, it was a near even split in goal line usage between himself and Jonathan Stewart. That's decreased. Now he's seeing about a third of the goal line work. Cam Newton's typically good for a few goal line vultures. Rushing production hasn't been there in a while. Hasn't had over 50 rushing yards in a game since week 9 of last season. Week 11 was his last rushing touchdown. And like you said, Greg Olsen, his top target, out. It's a concern. Just thought we'd be remiss if we didn't bring that up, just because it is such a good spot. But I agree, it's shaky. One player at the running back position, nice segue, is Jay Ajayi. I think he's the uber mega chalk this week, and I've gotten to some debates on Twitter about it. Not everyone's in agreement with me, but I know you are.
Yeah, I don't know how he's not the chalk of this week. He's coming off a 30-touch season opener on the road last week against the Chargers. He saw 4 touches in the red zone that week. He also picked up 2 targets in the passing game, catching both. He's got volume, red zone work, and the potential for receiving work. That checks the 3 boxes I think we're looking for in cash game consideration. I don't know how he's not chalk.
Well, one concern is he's been dealing with knee soreness for a few weeks, and he didn't practice on Wednesday. I'm confident he does play. But yeah, you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about volume. But more so than that was how often he was on the field. So he saw 30 touches, like you said, but he also played on 94% of his team's running back snaps in week 2. Only 6 times since 2014 has a running back seen at least 30 touches and played on at least 94% of their team's running back snaps in a single game, and 5 of those instances were from Le'Veon Bell. So he's seeing this immense bell cow, David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell-esque workload where he's on the field for passing down work, which he wasn't last season. This backs up things Gase and the offensive coordinator had said all offseason. He's 200% better now as a receiver. He could get as many as 350 rushing attempts if he stays healthy. Remember, this was the most run-heavy team in the league last season. And against set to face off against a Jets team where there should be plenty of positive game script. I don't see the Jets keeping this competitive. There's been some talk about it being a letdown spot because, the Dolphins are traveling from West Coast to East Coast, but remember, they just had a bye in week 1. This is their week 2. The Jets have surrendered 332 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns on 61 carries through the last 2 games. It's 5.4 yards per carry. I'm expecting big things. Learned my lesson on Zeke Elliott last week. Won't go too heavy, but I have a feeling he might be my highest owned guy. Another guy, speaking of bell cow workload, is Le'Veon Bell. So he was eased in week 1, which was a concern. Last week, he saw 92% of the team snaps, 27 of 29 carries, and all 4 of the team's running back targets. The issue, and I never thought I'd say it regarding Bell, he's been terribly inefficient. On 37 carries and 10 targets, he totals just 138 yards from scrimmage. As it currently stands, he's our 12th worst graded running back this season, out of 96 qualifying. Yet, over the past 3 seasons, he was one of our 2 highest graded, with no one else ranking top 10 in at least 2 seasons. Tyler, should we be worried about Bell, or is this the perfect spot to go back on him at a reduced ownership?
I think it's the perfect spot to go back to him. He's obviously their lead bell cow back. He's got one of the highest projections. He's got one of the highest ceilings. The Bears are losing Jarrell Freeman for the year. I don't see why you would try to be cute and avoid Le'Veon Bell this week. He's priced at $8,800, which is very affordable for him, considering he's been up near that high 9, 10K range over the past year. I just think that if you're not playing Bell, you're probably overthinking it, despite the Steelers being on the road here.
Right. I'm in agreement with you. Even if you're not too high on him, just the upside he offers warrants at least some exposure regardless. His price did come down. Remember, this is a guy who ranked first in fantasy points per game among all non-quarterbacks this past decade. Very high on him. Also, C.J. Anderson, who I thought was in a brutal spot last week. I loved his price, but we know Dallas kind of grinds down the clock, and they've been good against running backs. But they had some positive game script. But beyond that, Anderson just smashed. He's our 2nd highest graded running back this season. He ranks first in touches, tied for Mike Gillislee for first in red zone opportunities. He's facing a Buffalo defense that surrendered the 3rd most rushing fantasy points per game to opposing running backs last season. In season-long leagues, he's a must-start every week going forward, but I especially like this matchup in a game Denver should win convincingly. Tyler, are you with me? He's cheap. He's very cheap.
Yeah, he's very cheap, and I think he's going to – I don't know if he'll draw a lot of ownership. That's the thing. Like, when you're actually constructing lineups, his price point doesn't really fit into, like, how I think most people will go about constructing. With that being said, I think he'll have lower ownership. He has just as high of a ceiling as he does last week. I think he leads all backs in touches over the year. I don't know if I want to play him in cash, though. That's the thing. I do want some exposure to not just Anderson, but to the Denver passing attack as well. I think the way to do it, though, is in tournaments. I don't know if you can rely on Anderson in cash here.
That makes sense. And a really high percentage of his touches have been carries, so he might be a little riskier in DraftKings cash. I wanted to talk about the Thursday through Monday slate. Also, remember, there's a Sunday a.m. game in London, so make sure you have your lineups finalized before that game if you're playing in the slate. Remember one time, I think last year, I had a bunch of placeholder lineups with Blake Bortles in it. I was like, oh, I'll just go change it. And then I check at like 10 a.m. on Sunday, and I realize they're all live, and I'm weeping uncontrollably. But I know there's some running backs you like in that slate, and I do too for sure as well. Let's hear who you're on.
Honestly, I'm on almost every single back. Carlos Hyde is one of my favorite value plays at 5,200. I think he could be in a complete smash spot again. He's gone off week 1 and week 2 against defenses we didn't really expect it from. Don't know why it'll be much different here against the Los Angeles Rams. On the other side of the ball, Todd Gurley is another player who I think could get volume in a myriad of ways. We've seen him pick up the fourth most receiving yards by running back so far this year. He's not really going against a very tough defense here in the San Francisco 49ers. That should also be without Reuben Foster again. I think both running backs are in play if you're playing that Thursday through Monday slate. And the Sunday morning one, I'm also into Javorius Allen at 5K. The Jaguars defense is pretty good, but the Ravens, I think they have a chance to actually be tested in this one where we could see the game script go back and forth and create a neutral game script. That being said, it'll probably provide Allen with both carries and receptions. And he's obviously emerging as the lead back here. He's outsnapped Terrence West. There's just a ton of reasons to play Allen if you're playing all three of those games.
Right, I'm definitely with you. Like you said, Hyde has been ridiculously efficient. He exploded for 124 yards on just 15 carries against a Seattle defense that ranks second best in opposing yards per carry last season. Those 124 yards were the most Seattle has allowed to a single player since 2014. We knew heading into the season that he'd get that Shanahan bump in efficiency, but he's also used as a bell cow, tying a career high in targets in each of the last 2 weeks. Gurley as well draws a fantastic matchup. The Niners have been decent against opposing running backs these last 2 weeks, but a good friend of mine, Adam Harstead at Football Guys, does an article every year where he looks at when does the current season production matter more than prior season ADP, and he finds that it stabilizes around week 4. So still we should be looking at prior season ADP and prior season stats. And last season, San Francisco gave up a historic amount of production to RB1s. Last season, Bell ranked first in fantasy points per game. David Johnson ranked second. The 49ers defense ranked third. Like whatever RB1 was facing the Niners ranked third, and then Zeke, which is ridiculous. Again, I'm with you on Allen. Make sure you check and see what West's status is for the game. Maybe bump up some exposure if he is out. Another guy in that regard is Tariq Cohen. If Jordan Howard was seen with his arm in a sling on Sunday night, if he's out or limited, he becomes a great play, and he was kind of a great play already. Definitely stay abreast on all injury news. What about that Monday night game?
Yeah, that Monday night game's a little interesting. It's between the Cowboys and the Cardinals. I think a sneaky way to get exposure to this game is via Zeke. I think everyone will be off him after last week's disappointing performance. We have yet to see the Cardinals really face any pronounced running backs, but I'm expecting Dez to be shadowed by Patrick Peterson. I'm expecting Jason Witten to be shut down by Tyrann Mathieu and the other safeties. And if they want to move the ball, they're going to have to run through Zeke, and they're going to probably have to use their passing game through him as well. I think 4 to 5 receptions is well within his range of outcomes, and I think Zeke could be in a big bounce back spot here where not many people are on it.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you. I could definitely see him crushing, and at low ownership, that's awesome. We also didn't mention Leonard Fournette, who's in a good spot as well. I was low on him coming out. I thought he would just be a 2-down back, and was worried about TJ Yeldon getting involved in the passing game, but he was a healthy scratch last week. Fournette is just racking up the volume. I do a stat in an article every week called Actual Opportunity. It's just building out expected fantasy points based on workload. And for instance, on DraftKings, the best dollar per expected fantasy point volume values goes 1, Carlos Hyde, 2, Darren Sproles, 3, CJ Anderson, 4, Tariq Cohen, 5, Leonard Fournette. A lot of these guys were on. Was there any other running back you wanted to bring up, Tyler?
No, I think Fournette's a good play too. It's going to be a little sneaky there. I don't know how well game script will benefit him. We saw last week when they were in negative game script against the Titans in that 37-point blowout that Fournette had 14 carries and 5 targets. That being said, Fournette's been one of our best running backs from a missed tackle perspective. He's top 5 in the league so far with 7. I think he could be a sneaky play here on this Thursday through Monday slate. I don't know how much exposure I want, though. That's a problem.
I mean, fair points all around. It is also a tough matchup against Baltimore. I think I know who the wide receiver chalk is, and we don't prepare, but we just seem to constantly find ourselves on the same guys, always in agreement. Who do you think the chalkiest wide receiver is this week?
Okay, there. I've got two answers here. If you're paying up, it's probably AJ Green. If
Boom!
you're not, it's probably Davante Adams, given all the injuries to the Packers.
Bingo. All right, 100%. Before we get on to the Green Bay injuries, which is huge and something to monitor, I wanted to give my case for AJ Green. Typically, I'm more of a stats guy than a narrative guy, but one narrative I always buy into is that old adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. But I especially believe it when an offensive coordinator gets fired the following day after a receiver called for more targets, which is the case with AJ Green. He's a must-start, high ownership play at the very least against a bottom 3 secondary in the league. We were all over Julio Jones last week. Jones racked up 95 yards and 7 targets in the first half. Could have had an even bigger game had the team not passed the ball only 8 times in the second half. The Bengals should be trailing and passing both early and often against this high-powered Packers offense. He's just an easy DFS lock for me. I'm all aboard. The guy ranked first in fantasy points per game last year prior to his Week 12 injury. He's just good. And I know the offense is bad, but he's just good and should see the volume.
Yeah, and he's in a terrific matchup from a one-on-one perspective. So far this year, he's run 93% of his routes from the outside. That means he's going to run a lot against Demaryius Randall and Davon House. Randall ranks top 3 in most fantasy points per reception and yards per reception so far this season allowed. And House has yielded a 65% catch rate to opposing wide receivers. And his 40.5 grade from last year would have placed him bottom 12 among all cornerbacks had he played enough snaps to qualify. Basically with Green, if your process led you to Julio last week, I think you need to rinse and repeat for Green.
Yeah, just another point on those cornerbacks. Davon House was benched by the Jaguars last year. Demaryius Randall allowed the most fantasy points per snap of any cornerback this past decade in 2016. He is that bad. He is still that bad. There's going to be bracket coverage, I'm sure. A lot of zone, but AJ Green should still eat them apart. One guy I am very, very torn on. He's either a fantastic play, a must play in cash potentially, or a complete fade. And that's DeAndre Hopkins. So if we include plays called back due to penalty, Hopkins has seen 37 targets, or 12 more than the next closest receiver. Ranks third in expected fantasy points per game, first among wide receivers in expected fantasy point market share, first in air yardage market share. The efficiency is not going to be good with Deshaun Watson as your quarterback. He had a tough matchup last week against Adam Jones. He ran 71% of his was lined up against Jones on 71% of his routes. Jones ranks fourth best in fantasy points allowed per route and coverage over the past 3 seasons. The Patriots are giving up the third most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but we know the Patriots sell out to stop an opposing team's best player, and that's obviously Hopkins. Still, Hopkins is so cheap on DraftKings relative to his opportunity. Tyler, what are you doing here?
I'm very torn on Hopkins because, like you mentioned, Bill Belichick is known for taking away the opposing team's best wide receiver. Hopkins has seen 16 targets and 13 targets throughout the first 2 games this year. I don't know if he'll see that type of volume again, but given that all of their tight ends are still facing concussions, they have Lamar Miller, who's a so-so pass-catching back out of the backfield. I think they just released Jalen Strong. I don't know how much other wide receiver help they have. Hopkins will probably just be fed targets into double coverage by default. There's just not many receiving options for Deshaun Watson to throw to. I think Hopkins will get a lot of targets by default. I just don't know how much exposure I want to Hopkins, despite what should be a lot of targets.
Who do you think is going to lead the league in targets this week, if you had to put your money on anyone?
If I had to put my money on anyone, I would probably go with AJ Green in a game where the Bengals are 8.5 point road dogs.
All right. Do you think Hopkins would rank top 3?
Yeah, I mean, he could definitely be up there, especially if the Patriots get rolling. They're playing at home, massive home favorites. I could see this game going many different ways for the Patriots to score, but really only a few avenues for the Texans to keep pace, and that's throwing through Hopkins.
So I think he's a near lock to rank top 3 in targets this week, right? Just injuries to tight ends, Will Fuller out, easily Deshaun Watson's favorite target. He's targeting Hopkins on over 50% of his passing plays, which is ridiculous. And he's the 22nd highest priced wide receiver on DraftKings. So we know targets are the lifeblood of fantasy points for receivers. He's just so egregiously priced, but I have no idea where I stand on him just yet. It's just something I'm gonna have to work out, sleep on over the next few nights. But he's someone I felt we had to mention. Tyler, did you want to give your take on Davante Adams? You could sneak Martellus Bennett in there too if you want.
Yeah, I think they're both going to be great plays this week. The Bengals defense has had some trouble stopping on anyone. If it's really hard for us to make sound judgments right now at this point in the week on Wednesday when we're recording. We don't know the status of Jordy. We don't know the status of Randall Cobb. If both are playing, I think it makes an even better smash spot for Davante Adams with Jordy likely drawing the coverage of Pac-Man Jones and Adams getting the lesser corner in Drake Kirkpatrick. I think Adams and Martellus Bennett, as you mentioned, could both be in some sneaky good spots here. The Packers crush it at home. We've seen that Aaron Rodgers has thrown multiple passing touchdowns and I think 22 of 25 home games over the last few years. I think this is a great spot for him.
Yeah, I mean, if Jordy and Cobb are out, Adams definitely becomes a must play, as does Bennett. They both saw double-digit targets last week. Bennett ranks third among tight ends in routes run per game and third in targets. Adams had a tough matchup in week 1, but like you said, it's a bit better this week. I don't know. It just feels so gross, but yeah, he's probably the chalk if those guys miss time. There's a lot of cheap wide receivers to, I think, love this week. Guys like Marquise Lee, Jaron Brown, J.J. Nelson more than Jaron Brown, Rashard Higgins, even Jermaine Kearse with news that Austin Seferian-Jenkins is out of shape and might not play. I'm kind of on all those guys. They all saw massive workloads last season. Little reason to suspect that declines. Is there one from that group you like more than any of the others?
I would pay just a little bit more and go for Deshaun Jackson at 4,600. I was super into him last week and he kind of fell through, but could expect Mike Evans to be shadowed by Xavier Rhodes this upcoming week, and Deshaun Jackson will have a much easier matchup against Trey Waynes. Waynes has been pretty terrible in coverage, to be frank, and I think Djax has a good chance to just blow right by him for a touchdown. He's only priced at 4,600 on DK.
Yeah, he is egregiously priced there. He's the 46th most expensive wide receiver, when to me he feels like a lock to finish top 36 almost every single week, as streaky as he is. And like you said, the matchup could serve him well. Martavis Bryant is a similar type of athlete, runs a killer 9 route very fast, and he had a big game against them last week. Were there any other wide receivers you wanted to mention before we move on to tight ends?
Just one guy that I was super into this week was Demaryius Thomas. I think he's in a great spot this week, similar to how I thought Sanders was last week. I think it's going to be GT's time to shine, though, in week 3 against Buffalo, mainly because Demaryius Thomas will be running a ton of his routes against E.J. Gaines, who ranks bottom 5 in most fantasy points allowed per reception. He was our number 114 cornerback last year out of 119 qualifying. The passing game funnels through GT and Sanders, and Thomas has out-targeted Sanders 16-14. I think 8 targets is the floor for Thomas in this game, when it wouldn't really shock me for him to get double digits here against Gaines.
Yeah, anytime you mention one of the Gaines cornerbacks, for some reason all cornerbacks ever named Gaines have been terrible, or at least great to target for DFS. Any of those guys, or if you mention Randall, I'll always have a stat for you. But last season, E.J. Gaines allowed a 141.7 passer rating into his coverage on 72 targets. That ranks 5th worst of any cornerback this past decade. He is atrocious. And if you know a wide receiver, especially one as talented as Demaryius Thomas, who kind of disappointed last week with Sanders stealing all of the valuable target work, you got to play him.
For sure. The thing with wide receiver pricing this week as well, I think, just as a broader scope, I think since if you're trying to pay up for AJ Green, I think you're going to need to go cheaper. And I think any wide receiver priced under 7K could be in play. You can almost make a case for most of these guys here. And a ton of them down at this like 4-6K range, around even lower than 5K, I think, allow for a lot of flexibility in roster construction. Like we haven't even talked about like Rashard Higgins, who I think could be in for some massive targets this week.
Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of cheap wide receivers to like, and I think Higgins really might be my favorite. J.J. Nelson, a close second. And we also didn't bring up Devonta Parker and Jarvis Landry, who saw an immense workload last week. We were all on Marshawn Lynch in week 2, but it was Crabtree who had the big day. So maybe we're wrong about projecting game script, and one of those guys has a big day as well. Des Bryant's another guy who keeps seeing immense opportunity. He's going to be shadowed by Patrick Peterson. I want absolutely no part of. Let's move on to tight ends because I feel we talked about Martellus Bennett. He's a very strong play, especially if Randall Cobb and Jordy Nelson miss time. Zach Ertz is in that spot that the Giants, like the Broncos, are this team with two elite cornerbacks funneling targets to the tight end position. And I could see Ertz having a big day, though his price keeps climbing on both sites. There's a lot of cheap tight ends I like. Is there an expensive tight end you're particularly attracted to this week?
Yeah, and it really comes down to health. It's Jordan Reed. I think he's a smash play against Oakland if he's healthy. He was listed as a DNP on practice Wednesday due to his rib sternum injury. That's per Washington's team website. And he's going to be one that I'm going to be monitoring closely. Like I even have a sticky right next to my computer, check daily, because Oakland allowed the 4th most receiving yards and 8th most touchdowns to the position last year. Ignoring their week 2 versus the Jets, Tennessee targeted the tight end position 10 times against Oakland in week 1. And I think Reed could completely break a slate if he were to see a 10 target kind of volume.
Yeah, so I love Jordan Reed. I will always love Jordan Reed.
You sound like you're giving a eulogy here, Scott. Come on.
I don't know what to do here because I love Jordan Reed. He's amazing as a pass-catching tight end. He's currently graded as our 4th worst tight end via the pass, which is a concern. He came into the season with that toe injury that maybe has him hobbled. He doesn't look right. That said, like you said, the matchup, it's a dream spot against this poor Raiders linebacking and safety core. Listen, he's 3x. His 3x value on DraftKings is 16.2. Over his past 25 games, he averages 18.1 DraftKings fantasy points per game. So he looks like a near lock for cash. That's all games where he played at least 30 snaps. So that's assuming he's healthy. His 4x value is 21.6, and he hits that 33% of the time. And then in this dream matchup, he just looks like such a slam play. Wish I knew definitively how healthy he was. I'm not sure, but I'm definitely gonna have ownership to him. I wanted to talk up some cheap guys because I think there's quite a bit. I went nearly all in on Zach Miller last week. I think I'm going to do it again this week. He ranks 4th among tight ends in routes run per game, 2nd in expected fantasy points per game, 2nd in expected fantasy point market share. Listen, the team losing Alshon, Cam Meredith, Kevin White, they're fielding like the worst wide receiver core in the league. If the targets need to go to someone, why not Miller, who's like secretly the super efficient tight end? Since the second half of 2015, he ranks 7th at the position in fantasy points per game, and only behind Gronkowski and Reed in fantasy points per target. Efficiency is a concern with how bad this offense and quarterback play has been, but he's just so ridiculously cheap this week, and the volume is there that I feel like it balances out. There are a few other guys I like, but what do you think about Miller?
Miller's a guy that I was super into last year prior to his injury. I was playing him in season long, in DFS, no matter what system. I was just trying to get exposure to him because he was the best passing option the Bears had. And I think they're going to quickly realize that again in 2017 with all the other injuries they're facing a wide receiver. I think he's a great play against the Steelers. There's a lot of really cheap guys though that I'm super into. 3,700, a guy I'm into surprisingly is 36-year-old Benjamin Watson. He got 8 of 8 targets last week, looking a little cheaper. He's only on the Thursday through Monday slate though. Looking a little cheaper. Jack Doyle is a guy I'm pretty interested in, 3,600. He's seen over 20% of the team's target market share so far this year. You can look even cheaper if you want the Cameron Brate, I think's in play. Do we go back to Gerald Everett? What do you think, Scott?
I don't know. You're the cheap tight end whisperer, as we've established. I think the guy, those are all great names and guys I'm on as well, but I think Evan Ingram is worth a long look. He ranks 4th among tight ends in expected fantasy points per game, 6th in routes run per game. He's just, it looks like I'm always cautious regarding rookie tight ends, but he's serving one of the more attractive roles for any tight end, and he's super cheap this week. Charles Clay, maybe. We saw what Jason Witten did against that Denver defense. He's been the intended target on all 3 of Tyrod Taylor's end zone pass attempts this year. And they have that established chemistry that no other receiver on that team has with Taylor. I just don't see too many scoring opportunities this week. I think it's a good, yeah. Sorry, go.
No, yeah, I agree with you completely. I'm just looking even cheaper for guys that are punt plays, and Ed Dixon at 2,700. I've heard some talk about him. Not interested whatsoever in this. If I were to go super punt, I think the guy might be Seth DeValve with Cleveland. He's only at 2,600, but he's had 4 and 5 targets over the last 2 games, picking up some decent amount of fantasy points. Nothing to write home about, but enough, 8 points each game. Enough for you to float by if you're absolutely punting with a sub 3K tight end.
I don't have the stones to double down and make another wager with you, but I do have to squeeze a mention in for my boy George Kittle, who's seeing a substantial workload and is super cheap. I'm just realizing, man, there's a few guys we haven't talked about yet. Although it's in positions we've already mentioned. So I wanna pick your brain on Christian McCaffrey. So he's struggled in efficiency to the early start of his career, but he's actually seen a sizable workload. It's not as much of a committee as I originally assumed it would be. He's getting the larger bulk of the workload. He ranks 13th among all running backs in expected fantasy points per game, 3rd most, and the New Orleans Saints allowed the 3rd most receiving fantasy points to running backs last season. It's a dream spot. You don't have Olsen, so I like Kelvin Benjamin this week. Everyone's talking about Funchess as a cheap wide receiver, but I think they're forgetting that he's Funchess and not good. So I could see some more targets funneled McCaffrey's way. What do you think about him as like in a tourney?
No, I really like him in the tournament. I think we're going to see a lot of people on the passing attacks for both these games, and I think Christian McCaffrey can give you a good leeway into that via his receiving role for the Panthers. I also think he has a great chance of putting up a ton of points on the ground. The Saints can't stop anybody. I remember audibly laughing at one point watching one of the linebackers try to cover someone on a wheel route last week. I think McCaffrey is in a great smash spot here.
All right. Well, I got 2 more for you, and then you could bring up anyone you might still have on your sheet. But and they're kind of the same player, and that's Isaiah Crowell and Mike Gillislee.
Yes. I like them both in these spots. These are guys you're not normally trying to target heavily, but I think they make a ton of sense, especially on a site like FanDuel where we don't really worry about receptions. We saw last year LeGarrette Blount just smashed at home with multi-scoring touchdown games, tons of plays inside the 5-yard line, and I'd expect Gillislee to do that in tournaments. I think I want a ton of exposure to Gillislee. The Patriots against the Texans isn't very alluring from a game stacking kind of perspective, but what I really want to do is just get some exposure to Brady, some exposure to Cooks, some exposure to Gillislee. Looking at the Browns against the Colts is just going to be a garbage show. I'll just say that. I think Jacoby Brissett and Deshaun Kaiser could easily eclipse this 40-point game total that's here. I don't expect either defense to put up much resistance. I think Crowell could do a great job on the ground here, and I don't think I'm really worried about Duke Johnson seeing much volume there. What do you think about Duke? Because we've seen him bounce back and forth between slot receiver, which is now being taken over by Rashard Higgins, and we saw in week 2 that he went back to the running back role. What do you think about him here?
I'm not really on Duke Johnson this week, but did want to bring up Crowell. If you're not going to play him in DFS this week, and outside of the Jets in 2 weeks, I don't know when you will. Cleveland's actually favored this week, and I'm not sure when that would ever happen again outside of, again, the Jets. And like A.J. Green, he has that squeaky wheel narrative. He asked the coach for more carries, frustrated with his role. And few other cheap guys, Chris Carson, Jaquiz Rogers. We did mention Tariq Cohen, again, monitor Jordan Howard's health, but I think even if Howard does play, he's still locked into a heavy workload as a receiver due to how poor those wide receivers are. Was there anyone else left in your sheet?
No, I think we got through most of them. The only thing I do want to bring up is defenses. Defense I'm super into this week is the Eagles taking on the Giants.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, yeah. They're taking on a Giants team that allowed Dallas to score 12 fantasy points in week 1 and Detroit to score 17 points in week 2. Philly has averaged 12.5 DK points against the Giants over the last 6 games in the last 3 years. They're a mid-range price defense at just $3K, and they're one of my locks for cash games going into the week.
I'm absolutely with you. I want to target heavily favored teams, ideally, and defenses going up against a porous offensive line. The Eagles definitely are a great play against the Giants and their turnstile left tackle, Eric Flowers. Titans, Dolphins, Packers, Steelers are all guys who immediately come to mind. So I'm with you on all of those plays as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good defenses this week. I don't think you need to pay up for one of the top ones. There's just a lot of options.
All right, well, if that's it, I'm going to have to make good on my bet and perform this embarrassing rap for you. It is Alphabet Aerobics by Blackalicious. I wanted to do a Biggie song, but I could find literally none that could fly on the radio without cursing. So I'll do my best, and without further ado, it's here in 2 seconds, unless our editor cuts it out because it's too embarrassing and he wanted to save my reputation.
Now it's time for our wrap-up. Let's give it everything we've got. Ready? Begin.
Artificial amateurs aren't it all amazing? Analytically, I assault, animate things. Broken barriers bounded by the bomb beat. Buildings are broken, basically I'm bombarding. Casually create catastrophes, casualties. Canceling cats got the canopies collapsing. Detonated diamond dank daily doing dough. Demonstrations, Don Dada on the down low. Eating other editors with each and every energetic, epileptic episode. Elevated etiquette. Furious, fat, fabulous, fantastic. Flurries of funk felt. Beating the fanatics. Gift got great, global goods gone glorious. Getting godly in the game with the goriest. Hit 'em high, hella height, historical hate. Holocaust hints, hear 'em holla at your homeboy. Imitators idolize, I intimidate. In an instant, I'll arise in an irate state. Juiced on my jams like Jerry Curls, jocking joints justly. It's just me, writing my journals. Kindly, I'm kindling all kinds of ink on. Karate kick type Brits in my kingdom. Let me live a long life. Lyrically, lessons is learn lame louses, just lose to my livery. My mind makes marvelous moves masses. Marvel and move, many mock what I've mastered. Nap knowing I'm nice naturally. Knack never lack, make noise nationally. Operation opposition off, not optional. Out of sight, out of mind. Wide beaming opticals, perfected poem. powerful punchlines, pummeling patter puffs in my prime. Quite quaint quotes, keep quiet, it's quantum. Quarrelers ain't got a quarter of what we got. Really raw raps, rising up rapidly, riding the rushing radioactivity. Super scientifical sound search sought, silencing super fire saps that are soft. Tails 10 times talented, tuned tough. Take that, challengers, get a tune up. Universal, unique, untouched, unadulterated, the raw, uncut. Verb vice, lord, victorious, valid. Violate vibes that are vain, they can vanish. Why in the world would a wise wordsmith just weaving up words, weeded up in my work shift? Xerox my X radiation holes extra large, X height letters and xylophone tones. Yellowback, yak now, young ones, yaws. Yesterday's launch yard sale, I yawn. Zigzag zombies, zooming through the zenith, zero in zen thoughts, overzealous rhyme zealots.